All right, Jim, we have Barry Rose on the line.
Well, and ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who were born in the last couple of decades and who don't have any idea about what fan clubs used to be and bulletins and newsletters and the WFIA, the Wrestling Fans International Association conventions, and all the ways that we wrestling nuts used to keep track of each other and the wrestling business in the days before this fucking internet fucked the whole thing up. Our guest on the line is a guy I've known since 1978, and we're going to talk about that. And he is an expert on Florida wrestling. And he actually, Lance Storm and Chris Jericho owe their careers to this man. Ladies and gentlemen, Barry Rose. Barry, thanks for being on the program.
Oh man, what an honor, Jim. Thanks for having me. And I don't know, I got to get my kid down here. If Chris Jericho and Lance Storm owe their careers to me, my son needs to hear this. He needs to hear this immediately.
Well, hey, you might want to wait and edit it for language. If Brian can send you a PG version. And I guess we ought to lead with that because the story, basically you had a fan club for three guys that were big in the state of Florida in the mid 70s, Rocky Johnson, Tommy Siegler, and my God, help me.
Billy Robinson.
And Billy Robinson, of course. And, you know, the three more disparate individuals I don't know if you could find, but you grouped them together and you called the bulletin for the fan club that you put out the Thrill Seekers. And I was a member and subscribed and got the bulletin, still have some of them here in the closet. And I loved that name. And what was it, 1987? 15 years later, I researched that name, more than 15, 17 years later, I researched that name for when I brought Lance Storm and Chris Jericho to Smoky Mountain for their first wrestling gig in the United States and called them the Thrill Seekers. And I actually ran into you at one of the FanFests up north last year and thanked you for that. I didn't give you any money, but I gave you a hearty hand.
You did too, and it was. I got to say, and I was telling Brian this story as well. So I hadn't seen you since probably the Atlanta convention, and I want to talk about that also because I owe something that's really important in my life, which is Steak and Shake. I owe that to you and your mom. You and your mom are the ones who actually turned me on to Steak and Shake. But I hadn't seen you since probably 1980. So, and I want to say it was 3 years ago. Maybe you were up there. It was in Legends of the Ring up in New Jersey. So I hadn't seen you in 30-something years. And I didn't know that you were going to be there. And as I'm walking in, I'm like, oh, my God, there's Jim Cornette. Now, here's the funny thing. I don't look the same. You look exactly the same. So I say to my son, I go,
for better or worse,
yeah. Well, okay, sure. But, you still have your hair where, I'm kind of going a little bit naked up top. But I told my son, and my son, I think was 13 at the time. And I said, I knew Jim Cornette. Jim was a fan. He was really one of the best wrestling photographers back in the 70s before he got into business. And I wonder if he would actually remember me. So we come over to your table. I think you're with Mike Mondo. Is that correct?
Mike Mondo was there with me. Yeah.
Yep. So we walk over to the table, and I stick my hand out. I'm like, Jim, and I introduced myself, and you were like, oh my God! And you gave me the biggest hug. So my son is now looking at me going, wow, you really fucking do know this guy. Like, he just can't believe it. It's like, you really do know. You weren't just bullshitting me. And
normally everything you tell your child is full of shit. But in this case.
Oh, it's complete bullshit. Exactly. Complete bullshit. Right. So we start talking, and then, and you're kind enough, you actually start telling us the Thrill Seeker story. My son now is jaw open, eyes are wide, just staring, listening to all this. And then you do the kindest thing also. You said, I owe you. And I'm like, obviously you don't owe me anything. And you said, no, anything you want from my table, please feel free. So I'm like, well, I was kind of eyeing the book that you just put out. And you gave me an autographed copy of it, and you actually inscribed it, and it said, thanks for loaning me the name The Thrill Seekers, your friend Jim Cornette. And it was a great experience. And then we walked away from the table, and I swear my son just looked at me like, holy shit, Dad, you really do know Jim Cornette. Just a fantastic experience. But, to that point, you mentioned about newsletters and bulletins, and we obviously spent 3 conventions together, but I put out the Thrill Seekers, and you're 100% right. There really couldn't be 3 diametrically opposed professional wrestlers ever than Rocky Johnson, Billy Robinson, and Tommy Siegler. But it was really, with the exception of your photographs, which you were kind enough, you actually sent me photographs that I used. That newsletter was a piece of shit. It was something that And I'll say it all the time. When people say there were some great newsletters out there in the day, Pete Letterberg did the Steve Kern fan club, and it was just tremendous. And my effort was really indicative of a 13-year-old with, no journalistic skills whatsoever, and just access to a copy machine. So it sucks. So,
that's what we used to do if for people who are thinking, what the fuck is a bulletin, is a newsletter? And I guess, some people still get Dave Meltzer's Wrestling Observer on paper, the way God intended wrestling newsletters to be. But when the people would start fan clubs, basically you'd find hopefully somebody you knew at a copy shop that would give you a deal, because copies were between 2 and 5 cents a page at that point, and you had to mock up your shit and use double stick tape or whatever and put the pick clippings or the pictures on the page, and then go to the copy shop and get them all copied for however many people at, 30 people or 100 people or whatever it was that you were sending them out to. And then you had to address the envelopes and mail the shit. And you had to be dedicated back then to be one of us, which was the hardcore wrestling nerds that wanted to not only find out what was going on in other wrestling territories, but let, those same people know what was going on in yours. It took some time and some effort, even if it was the shits like yours.
Yeah, exactly. And part of it too, you could go to the newsstand, you could get the after magazines, which were generally, if they weren't complete kayfabe stories, they were also 3 and 4 months behind on a lot of the angles. So if you wanted to find out what was going on in St. Louis, or if I wanted to find out what was going on in Texas, I would have to get a newsletter or a bulletin. And we were really fortunate in knowing Terry Robert Justice. And it's funny, you also bring up the fact about, owning a print shop and knowing somebody. His parents owned a print shop. So this guy was producing some weeks he would do 7 newsletters in a week.
Oh, yeah, and clippings from every territory, the newspaper ads that showed the lineups, and he would focus and spotlight on people, and they were so clean and so well done. He had a bit of OCD to him. And, I've got a huge stack of those still, but that's what we did to share our fandom back before you could just, click on the computer and send whatever you want or say whatever you want. When you were in Florida as a kid, you're up in the Northeast now, but how did you first find championship wrestling from Florida and fall in love with everything?
Yeah. So, it's growing up. I'm 53 now. And I think I was 7 or 8 years old. And my dad actually knew a bunch of wrestlers from when he was growing up in Columbus, Ohio. He played semi-professional basketball for a team in Columbus, Ohio. So he worked out at the same gym where Al Haft was. And he knew Ray Stevens. He knew Ray Stevens. He knew Frankie Kane. He knew a bunch of guys. So whenever these guys would come to Florida, he would go see them. And one of my first memories was him taking me, and I got to meet Ray Stevens, which would have been 72. But it was my dad. My dad, we didn't have a ton of sports growing up in Florida at the time. We had the Miami Dolphins. And we had an ABA basketball team for a year or so, but we really didn't have a whole lot. So wrestling was a fixture, obviously, throughout the entire state. But every Wednesday night, there was anywhere between 3,500 to 5,000 fans packing the Miami Beach Convention Center. And my dad took me, and I think as I got older, as I became 9 and 10 years old, it became a ritual every single Wednesday night for us. And I would have never traded any of that for the world. And as I got a little bit older and my dad was maybe a little more relaxed with the fact that, we were going out and staying out till midnight and then waking up at 6 a.m. so I could go to school, we started doing West Palm Beach on Monday nights and then Fort Lauderdale on Friday nights. So I owe it all to my dad. And, I've tried to pass this on down to my son. My son loves professional wrestling and, he'll watch current product, and certainly he'll be extremely critical, as I am, of current product. But at the same time, he'll get on YouTube and he'll start pulling up some old stuff from the 70s and the 80s and just raving about angles and things like that. So, so it's great.
What you just said, those were the days, as they say. Somebody ought to write a song like that, because living in the Miami area, West Palm's how far? 40 miles, as I recall, 60 maybe.
Oh yeah, 40. Matt, it was 60 minutes, so it's probably 40 miles. You're right.
And then in Fort Lauderdale, so literally you could see 3 cards a week within an hour radius. That, like you said, were 3,000 to 5,000 people in Miami and a couple thousand in Fort Lauderdale and whatever West Palm was doing. The point is the numbers of people that were going to the matches back then, and they were major talent studded wrestling cards. It wasn't like some outlaw shows. Every week you were seeing some of the top names in the NWA because of the respect Eddie Graham obviously had amongst the business. But it was a big name territory. So you saw all the top talent.
Yeah, we really did too, and it's funny. So I run this Facebook group, which is the Championship Wrestling from Florida Archives, and every so often, every 6 months or so, somebody will start a thread, and it's usually, can we name guys that never worked the state of Florida? And it really comes down to maybe 5 or 6 names. Everybody at that point, it was passing through the state of Florida, and as you said, being in Miami, within an hour in either direction, I could go and I could see 3 wrestling cards within a week, and all 3 cards were going to be great. It wasn't like it was going to be any sort of filler or anything else. These were going to be fantastic cards. So I wouldn't have changed, my childhood and being able to see wrestling for anything. And one of the reasons I think I do the Facebook group, obviously, is, I want to recapture and maybe relive some of that. But at the same time, I want answers to some things. There are some questions that I guess I've been curious about for the last 40 years or 50 years. And by putting a lot of this stuff on, we've got Don Morocco in our group, and we got Manny Fernandez and Jerry Briscoe, Buddy Cole. So we actually have a lot of the boys that work the state of Florida actually in our group, and they're answering our questions.
Hey, how did you get, and I mean, I know with your dad, I'm sure he probably told you a few things that were, but how did you, as you got older and you saw things, how did you get smartened up? Back in the day when it was not cool for any of the boys to smarten up anybody outside the business. Sometimes they didn't even smarten up their own families.
Yes. So the first time was, so it broke my heart because, obviously we hear all these things, and I was a kid, so I'd go to the matches every week, and they would say, wrestling it's not real, it's a fixed sport, and I would defend and say, absolutely not. I see what goes on. You're not going to convince me. And there was a match between the Masked Superstars, who was, it was Jerry Lawler and Don Green under masks. With Sam Bass, the late Sam Bass, as their manager, and they were facing Cyclone and Omar Negro. And Sam Bass took off his boot, hit Omar Negro over the head. Omar went down, and about 6 inches off the mat, he pulled something out of his trunks and cut his forehead with it. Oh! And so when this happens to an 11-year-old kid whose entire life is professional wrestling, you can imagine. I didn't sleep that night, and here it is 42 years later, and I can still recall this. So that was a devastating moment. So that was kind of the introduction to it. And then as things went on...
by the way, I'm going to see Lawler next month, and I'm going to tell him that a friend of mine from Florida got smartened up by watching his match.
So I think that was the initial with that. I told Brian this story too, but Frankie Kane came down to Florida, and he was refereeing in 1980. And my dad, we were actually in Tampa. My dad who loved wrestling and he loved being able to do something with me as far as a bonding experience. We would go on trips. We were down in Tampa. We saw a Tampa TV taping. We would do the house show at the Ford Homer Hesterly. We would go all over the state, but he introduced me to Frankie Kane one night when Frankie was refereeing in 1980, and he had a 10-minute conversation, and I just stood there. I absorbed it. I listened. And when it was all over, my dad looked at me and goes, you just met the great Mephisto. And I was like, what? And yeah. And so on that note too, in running Rocky Johnson's fan club when I was younger, I was very, very good friends with his son. And I stayed over their house in Tampa, and then the night of the Super Bowl, if you remember the Super Bowl of wrestling in 1978, which was Race versus Superstar Graham, title versus title, The Rock, the future Rock, actually slept over my house. So I was, yeah, exactly. I tell people that, and they're like, sure he did. But, so it was kind of cool. So he slept over, and I guess I saw him last probably around the late 70s, 79 or so, and I didn't see him for years. And then out of the clear blue sky, And when he was playing football for the University of Miami, which would have been like 90, 91, somewhere right around there, I get a phone call one day, and it's Dwayne, it's Rocky Johnson, and his wife at the time was Adam Ivia. And I hadn't talked to them in so many years. So we had a full conversation, and then Dwayne and I were talking, and I was pretty smart to the business at that point, but he kind of opened my eyes to a lot of things as well.
Well, that's right. We got to talk about the WFIA because, like you said, that's where we met in 1978. They had the convention every year. This Wrestling Fans International Association convention would go to a different city, a different territory, and for a weekend, you'd go to the TV taping and you'd go to the house shows, and they would have wrestlers made available for the banquet, where, of course, conveniently those wrestlers would get awards. And then, they gave photographer awards. That's where I still have my trophies and et cetera. But you were in 78. If I was 17 and you were probably about 14, 15, thereabouts.
That's correct. Yep.
And that's where I met Pete Lederberg also, and Norman Dooley, Weasel Dooley was with us. I still have a picture of you and Weasel and Pete Lederberg doing the Kevin Sullivan, Mark Lewin, and I think Great Mephisto stuff that they from Atlanta a couple years later.
Yep.
But even at the time, I was the photographer, and you knew all these guys through your dad and had talked to them and running a fan club and et cetera. We still didn't really know at that point the terms booker and finish and all the inside terms that people know now. We kind of knew what was going on, but we didn't know exactly how it was done or who was manipulating at that point. But when we got together, there was groups of fans that would come that were kind of smart, and there were groups that weren't smart. And I've mentioned this before. Remember the feeling out process when you first met somebody, like, oh, these fans are from Dallas, these fans are from the Carolinas, whatever. You had to kind of tiptoe around and ask a few certain questions, because if they weren't smart at all, you didn't want to burst the bubble, right? And yet it was kind of a strange feeling out process for the fans not to smarten anybody up that wasn't already kind of with it.
Yeah, and to that point too. So it's funny that you say Texas, but you remember Eloise Mascoro, and from Dallas, and she was in love with the Von Erich boys. And if you would have ever said to her that wrestling was not 100% a legitimate sport, she would have taken you outside and kicked your ass, even though she was an 80-year-old grandmother at the time. So you're 100% right with that. There really were two groups of fans, and there was and I think it was the ones like us, maybe a little smarter to the business, but you did have a lot of your fans that were coming in. It tended to be the older people. They were coming from Texas and other areas, and they were convinced, no, it's 100% a legitimate sport. So we never wanted to burst their bubble. At the same time, for us, we were cliquish in a sense also. I remember going to cards with you, and as I mentioned, you and your mom, we took a group of us to Steak and Shake in Atlanta. And Pete and myself are still friends. We've been friends since '76. So, we really did tend to stay together at that point. But I'll tell you one of my favorite memories, and I was telling this to Brian. So these WFIA conventions were a blast, and part of it was there was nothing else like that. Now you've got your Monster Mania conventions. There's a million conventions that are out there that cover every sort of genre. But for wrestling, this was the only thing that we had. So to be able to go to this was a real highlight. But in Atlanta also, I remember it was Atlanta or it was Memphis, and I'm not sure which one it was, but you and I were wrestling in the hotel pool.
It was Memphis.
Okay. In Memphis, and you gave me, you were chopping the shit out of me at that point as well, stiff as a motherfucker, but you gave me a suplex, and I swear I must have been 10 feet up in the air. we were on the edge of the pool, and you gave me a suplex right in the pool. And the other thing I remember was, and I don't want to put you on the spot with this, but you did this killer impression of Joe LeDuc. And I listened to you do Joe LeDuc. Now, you did Joe LeDuc better than Joe LeDuc did. He actually did Joe LeDuc.
I'm glad you didn't say that in front of Joe LeDuc.
Exactly. But I came home from that convention speaking like a French Canadian for literally 30 days after. Your Joe LeDuc was absolutely incredible.
Well, the reason I say Memphis also is because if you remember, I think that Memphis was the first time that we met Brian Hildebrand, Mark Curtis. That was the first one that Brian had come to, and he had actually been training and gotten to work. I see there were no outlaw shows at that, or what they call independent shows now, but there were no outlaw shows at that time, and you couldn't just get in a ring and buy tights and boots and let people, or people would let you wrestle. But Brian, amongst all of us, had actually been able to do that because there was an outlaw group in West Virginia. He was from Pittsburgh, but he went to school at the University of Dayton, and he was able to work some of those shows in West Virginia. And he had said to me, "Oh, you ought to come up and work with me sometime in West Virginia." I'm like, "Fuck, I wouldn't do that in a million years, brother." Right? But we were doing it, if we were having matches amongst ourselves after one of the shows one night in the lobby. Actually, the lobby of the hotel. We're slamming each other and dropping elbows and everything in the lobby of the hotel, like 1 o'clock in the morning. And in comes Randy Tyler, who was working the Memphis territory at the time, and sat down and watched us knuckleheads having these goddamn matches, and he was enjoying it. Actually, I'm sure it was entertaining. But going back to Knoxville, I told you right before when we were setting this up, I have this brochure. The Hotel Andrew Johnson was the scene of the 1978 WFIA convention, and I have a brochure that the pictures are beautiful. For example, the Maskers Lounge, Masquers, and it's all with white tablecloths and linen and red chairs and wood paneling, and this handsome restaurant gleams with well cared for fittings and tantalizes with tempting aromas of Southern delicacies prepared by master chefs. And it has the panoramic views from the 18 floors of Southern hospitality and authentic sophistication. And these pictures of the rooms that are spotless, and the threshold of elegance, the pleasures of home, entertain with pride. This was I don't know when this brochure was printed. I believe it was probably the early 50s. 918 South Gay Street for our fans in Knoxville that want to go there, and if it's still there. Free 21-inch television in each room, completely air conditioned. It was this state-of-the-art hotel, but not in 1978. Describe your of this fucking rattle trap that we got booked into.
It was without a doubt. And look, again, I was a kid, but looking back, it's probably the biggest shithole that I ever would have stayed in had my parents let us stay there. So we drove from Miami Beach, Florida. I grew up in a 20th floor condominium, and I only say that because I want, it's the parity between the two, but we drove from Miami Beach to Knoxville, and we checked in, and I forget what time, it's probably 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and we're at the front desk. So you walk through the front doors, and it's a desolate lobby. I mean, there's just nothing there. It's dusty. It smells. It's dirty. And there's an old guy behind the counter. And we walk up, and I'm all excited. Obviously, it's my first convention. It's all I've been thinking of. It's like a dream come true for me. And we walk up, and there's a guy back there, and he crusty old motherfucker. And there's a sign behind him, and I don't remember exactly what the sign says, but the sign is like, no prostitutes, no drugs, no guns. So my mom, my mom sees a sign, and she's already given us the stink eye, like, I don't know about this. And I'm like, this is the world to me. So it gives us the key to go up to the room. We take the elevator. If you remember the elevators, I think there was 4 elevators. Only one was actually working. One
out of the 4 worked, and that one was iffy, and you felt like you were taking your life in your hands. So everybody was asking for low floors so they could walk.
Yeah. And it was making some sort of clanking noise, like it was really frightening. So we get up there, and if you remember the hallways had like single light bulbs every 10 or 15 feet. So it looked like a mental institution. I mean, it was really frightening in the hallways. So my parents open up the door, they flick on the light, and the second they flick on the light, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 100 cockroaches scatter.
Oh.
So my mom, that's it. We're not staying here. I don't, fuck this convention. We're out of here. And she's, I'm sorry. You're my son. I love you, but there's not a chance. And I'm trying to fight it. God knows why I was trying to fight it, but I'm like saying, but we need to. No. So we're out of there. And there's it's either a Hilton or a Hyatt that's right around the corner, literally right down the street. Beautiful hotel, large hotel, beautiful lobby, glass elevators, everything. And my parents decided to stay there. So, every day I'm making the trip over to the shithole, to the Andrew Johnson. So I think everything's great over at the other hotel. And this was our first time in Knoxville.
I tell you,
so,
here's the thing. My mom probably felt the same way as your mom did about it, but we did not have the cockroach experience, or even I would have bailed. We did have the elevator experience, and I got a separate. My mom had a room across the hall from me, and I'm trying to think whether Norman Dooley had come with us on that trip. I know he went to Memphis with us, but at any rate, there was another, I don't know if you remember this, but there was another young 16-year-old fan that was there. It was also a ringside photographer named Eddie Gilbert.
Sure do.
And,
so, yeah.
and here's the thing. He actually switched rooms to be closer to my mom and I, because one of the people attending the convention, and I don't remember his name, and obviously I wouldn't say it if I did, but he was very enamored of Eddie back at a time when those things were not openly spoken of. And Eddie was so scared shitless because he kept slipping notes under Eddie's door. Hey, you want to get together and take some Falls Pro style? I remember that quote because he brought it and showed it to my mom and me. He's like, can I be in the room next to you guys? So, and then my cousin Gail, who was going to the University of Tennessee at the time, and she was a few years older. Obviously, she was in college. She came over, and Eddie just was like enamored of her. So he spent a lot of time with us that weekend. That's where I first got to know Eddie real well.
Yeah, too. That was the first time I met either of you, and Eddie and I also bonded on that vacation and on that trip. And I think part of it was that fan was slipping these notes, and Eddie wanted to do anything he could to get away from that. And I was kind of a precocious. That's probably the nicest way to say it. I was a precocious 14-year-old. So Eddie and I were actually getting into trouble running around that hotel. And at one point, Tommy Gilbert came looking for Eddie, and when he found him, we were actually hanging out, and he reamed out Eddie, and I was scared shitless when Tommy Gilbert started reaming him out. But we were staying at this Hyatt or this Hilton, and again, I grew up on Miami Beach. It's different than being in Knoxville, and very different than being in Knoxville. And we're riding the hotel, the elevator the first day, and we're going down, and as we're riding, two or three guys get on, and they're all wearing swastikas. And so it turns out the NRA was having their convention at the same hotel where we were staying at. So my mom, again, I was getting the stink eye. She didn't make us move again, but I spent so much time at that hotel. And, if you remember, Terry Robert Justice actually picked up a nickname, and it was TJ Raid. And the TJ was Terry Justice, and the Raid was for the insect killer.
Yes,
yeah, that cockroach issue was everywhere. I mean, it was just all over that place.
Oh, but now I guess now people have gone, well, Jesus Christ, why would you do this? Because the wrestling was tremendous. Not only did we get to see a show at the Knoxville Civic Coliseum, and I mean, that's when Ronnie Garvin did that incredible juice job and bled more than anybody I've ever seen with the chain match against Boris Malenko. And I have a picture on my office wall right now of the Mongolian Stomper who was Malenko's charge, and Malenko was managing him, and he came in and interfered, and he's beating the shit out of Ronnie. We got to see the TV taping at Channel 10 that Saturday afternoon with Les Thatcher and Phil Rainey hosting Southeastern Wrestling. We got to go to the spot show, and I believe it was Tazewell, Tennessee, a town that
Tazewell.
Yes.
Yeah.
I ended up running that town 15 years later. I'm like, what the fuck? And I mean, they just had such great names up and down the show that night that it was a world-class wrestling show with 5,000 people in a Knoxville Coliseum. And we were just staying 3 blocks down in the Roach Motel. Yeah.
Who was Stomper with? Was he with Gorgeous George Jr. then?
No, Malenko was managing Stomper because Stomper ran in. Why do I remember these things? Stomper ran in and unhooked the chain when the referee got bumped, and they started beating the shit out of Garvin, and he's bleeding like crazy. And once again, that was the thrill. And in Memphis the next year, when the convention was there, we all got to see, not only did we get to see Jackie and Roughhouse Fargo team up against Wayne Harris, Larry Latham, and Danny Davis. So we got to see Roughhouse Fargo. We also got to see the guy named Terry Boulder that would later become Hulk Hogan. And we also got to see the very first time that Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy came to the ring and were introduced as the Fabulous Freebirds and used the Skinner music as their entrance. And I look at Brian Hildebrand, we're at ringside taking pictures, and he looked back at me, and I said, "This shit could catch on." Yeah, and it was in one night. We got to see Roughhouse Fargo, the Fargo brothers, who'd been the biggest attraction in Tennessee for the past 20 years. We got to see the future biggest star in the history of wrestling. And we got to see a legendary moment where entrance music became rock and roll music. Entrance music became a thing in wrestling, all in the same night on one show.
Yeah, and you grew up in that territory, so that was your territory. That was my first time ever in the Memphis area, so that was absolutely huge. Cowboy Ron Bass was there, which I remember, and then whatchamacallit, Brutus the Barber Beefcake was doing Ed Boulder.
Well,
he was Hulk Hogan. Yeah.
It was Terry and Eddie Boulder against Ron Bass and Pete Austin in the main event.
Pete Austin.
Yeah, they were trying to get the Hulk over, so they put him in the main event on after Lawler and Dundee against the Freebirds and the Fargos against the Blonde Bombers. And at the time, the Hulk and fucking Beefcake both stunk so bad that the people were filing. There was like 7,500 people in the Coliseum, 8,000, and they were filing out during the main event, which never happened because it was usually always Lawler.
Yeah, they were. But what I remember was Roughhouse Fargo had that entire – there was 10,000 people there that night, if I'm correct, too. Roughhouse Fargo had that every single member of the audience in his hand that night. And here was a guy that was 50 or 60 years old, didn't look like a wrestler. What a great gimmick. That was so much fun.
And for people who didn't grow up on Tennessee wrestling, and Roughhouse is a whole other story. We could do a show on Roughhouse, but – they say, well, that shit, like one time the sheep herders, Jonathan Boyd, when they came in the territory and they were going to work with Roughhouse in Nashville. And we tried to give him he's going to go under the ring and he's going to pull you under the ring and he's going to steal my shoe because I was the manager at ringside and he's going to pour a drink in it and do all this stuff. And Boyd said, well, what the fuck? That shit's not going to get over. And Roughhouse, as he did every night, he stole the show, but the people believed it. It was the most preposterous thing for somebody from somewhere else who didn't know how the people had been raised, but they truthfully believed that Roughhouse Fargo was being sprung by Jackie from the mental institution to get even with the heels, and they went with it. And it was visually just preposterous. And Jerry Jarrett said that Roughhouse Fargo per capita was the biggest draw he ever booked in his territory because you didn't put Roughhouse in every week, but when he came in a few times a year, it sold out. It was a different world.
It was a different world too. But for me, again, being completely alien and completely foreign to it, oh my God, was it so much fun! It was just a blast. Vivian St. John was there that night.
Oh yes,
yeah, I remember that.
Do you remember what we got to see in 1980 when the convention was in Atlanta?
Oh, absolutely. You're talking about the cage match?
The original cage, not the one in 85 where they redid the angle, but the original cage.
Oh, yeah. Where
Dusty basically got fed to the wolves when Ole turned on him and the Assassins and Ivan Koloff and Ole and Gene Anderson all beat the shit out of, and the fans were trying to climb the cage. And I used to give the interviews out in OVW for wrestling school of Ole and Dusty after that thing. It was the hottest angle I've ever seen in person, where they sent the baby faces to try to climb the cage to make it look good. And then the baby faces realized, wait a minute, there's more fans climbing the cage than we are.
Yeah. Did you know that was going to happen that night? Did you? Because I know some fans actually were kind of predicting it, saying that, what if everybody decides to turn on Dusty, which I never in a million years would have ever thought.
Well, see, we didn't have cable in Louisville at the time, so I was not up to date on the Georgia Championship Wrestling, angles and programs, except if I could drive over to Weasel's and watch Georgia Wrestling on his cable, 25 miles away over in southern Indiana. So, the one thing that kept me from being in the middle of the riot, I didn't know ahead of time they were going to have a cage match, so I didn't take high-speed film. And at the time, when you used the flash, if it was a cage match, it would reflect off the links, and it looked like shit. And I said, fuck it, I'll sit this one out, and then I'll shoot Tommy Rich and Harley Race for the title with Luther as referee, which was the nominal main event of the thing. And if I hadn't set that cage match out and gone up to all of our seats where they had the WFIA fans, I would have been in the middle of that riot. They would have stripped. I mean, people were stripping each other's clothes off, trying to climb that thing. I would have lost my camera equipment. It was a madhouse. The cops, it took them half an hour to get the heels out. Remember?
Oh, it was crazy. And there were, and I know I told Brian this also. There were grown men crying in the audience that night.
Yeah.
Like there were actually, you never see anything like that. There were grown men crying, fearing for Dusty's life. And I remember Lars Anderson coming out trying to get into the cage, and he kept getting beat down, and that was just a hell of a night. But do you remember there was another match, and this match, I think for different reasons, was Baron von Raschke versus Tony Atlas.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the worst matches I think I've ever seen live, ever.
Talk about a clash of styles. It did not come together.
Yeah, they did not come together. And I just remember, and we've seen matches, there's good, there's bad, there's ugly. I just remember going, wow, this is really bad. But that was an exciting, that was my last convention too. And that was the,
and as a matter of fact, wait a minute, I got to back up. Also, your boy Steve Kern challenged Les Thornton for the World Junior Heavyweight title, and also Dutch Mantell wrestled this kid from out west named Chavo Guerrero on the undercard.
Wow. Which I don't even remember. Do you still have the program?
I've still got the pictures I took. Yes, I have everything.
Wow. Yeah, that was my last. Did you continue to go to conventions after that one?
I can't remember where 1981 was, but I think the last one I went to was 82 because that was in Indianapolis, and that was just 100 miles up the road. Once again, we weren't going to fly. If it was placed, right. we could drive to Knoxville, we could drive to Memphis, we could drive to Atlanta. We drove to Indianapolis. The Indianapolis, if that was 82, that was right about a month before I actually got in the business. So then I had to quit, and they kept doing it. I think they came back to Memphis in 85 again, but I was already gone.
Right.
But I had to quit at that point, unfortunately. But fortunately, I was in the business.
1981 was Houston.
Yeah, so Houston was too far. We didn't go, and then we went to Indianapolis. Me and Weasel went in 82. And my poor mother at least didn't have to suffer that, because she wasn't going to let me, when I was like 15 or 16, she wasn't going to let me go off by myself. But by the time that Indianapolis came around, me and Weasel could go off on our own.
It's good parenting.
And thank you, by the way, Brian Last, with you know everything. You have everything at your fingertips. By the way, Barry, Brian told me that I was allowed to say, because I mentioned to him when I ran into you that I didn't recognize you, because he told me I'm allowed to say this phrase. You used to have the sweetest Jew-fro in history. And it went away.
Yeah. He's 100% right, man. You got to be honest. It was like a Jimmy Garvin kind of Jew-fro thing. Yes. I did have a really sweet Jew-fro. I wish I fucking had hair, Right. Exactly. I've got a fucking goatee now, and I got no hair on the top of my head. But I haven't heard Jew-fro in years. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Jim.
What made you give up going? Was it just then you got into college and just time and sources?
I started getting laid in 1981.
Well, there you go.
As much as I loved wrestling, once I did some
matches, I got laid by going to the matches. So you could have actually combined the two.
You could have, yeah. Once that's 81 was my first serious girlfriend, and at that point, and I think I even phased out of wrestling. I couldn't have even told you what was even going on for about a year. We broke up, and then I kind of rediscovered it. But yeah, it was. I kind of regret. I don't regret getting laid, but I regret the fact that I didn't keep in contact, and I think I was so enamored with getting laid that I just pushed all wrestling off to the side. But Pete Letterberg actually wound up running. You mentioned Memphis in '85, and he was part of that great angle. He and Howard Baum presenting the tag team of the year to Tommy Rich and Eddie Gilbert, and that's where Eddie Gilbert turns on Tommy Rich, and Tommy Rich just bled like as Tommy Rich used to, just bled like no one's business. That was just a hell of an angle. And the WFIA, I think we were really lucky because that was kind of the tail end of the glory years for the WFIA. And I know, within a year or two, there was a lot of issues, and people were getting, they were getting kicked out, and it's just a lot of internal strife and a lot of turnover with it. So we were really fortunate in those years. And I would have liked to. Miami Beach had one. 71, I think it was, where they did it, and I didn't know about it but I was really young, so I didn't even know about it. But we really were fortunate. And your photography, and I think I still owe you money for photos, probably 35 years later.
Oh, keep it.
I appreciate it, sir.
I'll get my agent Swifty Flanagan on you.
I appreciate it, but you were such a great photographer, and everybody talks about Jim Cornette, the great wrestling manager, and obviously, you can cut a promo like nobody else's business, but really as a photographer, you were one of the best photographers back in the heyday. Just the quality of your work. I still have a huge stack of your photos here as well.
Well, and actually you mentioned Pete Lederberg, because I've seen Pete. Pete's come to the Charlotte FanFest a number of times, and I've seen him several places, and we've talked on the phone a few times last year or two. But he not only took some great pictures, but he's assembled now, like, I guess, the collections of all the great Florida photographers, Ruth Oman, and I think he's got Howard Bombs, doesn't he? Or probably,
no, Howard kept his, but he bought Ruth's. And he bought Brian Berkowitz. Yeah. And Brian was great. And then there was a guy named Don DeLeon in the early 70s. He bought out that collection. And if you remember Michael Bauman, I think he came to a convention or two.
I bought rare shit from Michael Bauman in Charlotte a number of times, and he hasn't come lately. And I got mad because I didn't want to spend, every penny I had, but I could have at his booth. He had such great classic shit.
So Michael contacted me, and Michael's MIA. The last we heard, he was selling his condo. This is years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. He was selling his condo in a suburb of Atlanta and moving somewhere to Kansas or Missouri to an assisted living facility, and was going to get married. But before that happened, I spent over $4,000 with him just buying parts of his collection. He had incredible rare memorabilia. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. So the old posters, and it just so many copies of them that you just didn't even know where to start. And that I certainly hope he's all right. I don't give a shit about Michael, but I just hope his stuff is still. No, I'm kidding. If you're out there somewhere, Mike, I love you, and sell me your shit cheap. But
yeah, exactly. But his dad was a photographer. If you remember, his dad was Paul Bauman. He was a guy that shot for a lot of the After magazines. He was the Florida guy, and he sold, I guess Michael got the negatives, and Michael sold the negatives to Chris Swisher, who also has assembled this. Chris has got Little Al's, remember Little Al Vavasseur?
Yes, all the Louisiana stuff before it was Mid-South.
Yeah, he's got all of his negatives. He's got all of Paul Bauman's, and he's got a couple other guys. Maybe Gene Gordon? I don't know. He's got somebody else, too.
Possibly, because, Chris Swisher is the go-to guy. Now we're just really nerding out, and people are like, what the fuck? Why don't they talk about goddamn WWE? No, Chris is the go-to guy for Mark James and his books that he does with me or with anybody else when we're talking about old Southern talent that really goes back to the 40s and 50s. Chris has an amazing collection out here, and it's all the James boys, Mark and Chris. And get well, Chris. We love you. But they were up here a couple months ago going through my pictures, and I still have all my negatives, but of course they're not sorted. They're in huge cardboard boxes, and I've got a chest of one of those old, chest of drawers, as my mom used to call them, that you'd have in your bedroom with like 25,000, 3.5 by 5 prints. And Mark spent all day, like 12 hours scanning, and got through 2,000, and we didn't even finish half of one of the drawers.
Wow.
So I envy Chris because he apparently has his stuff categorized, cataloged, computerized. You can find anything at the drop of a hat. But that's how the history of this whole business, stays alive is through these people's efforts.
Yeah, it is true too. And I tell this story every so often. But so there's a movie, Fried Green Tomatoes. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a woman's movie essentially, but there's a scene there where they're talking, and it's basically one girl says to another girl, she's telling her a story about something that occurred 30, 40, 50 years ago. And she says, "Why did you tell me that story?" And she says, if we don't tell these stories are going to be forgotten. So I agree 100%. There's no focus on history when it comes to professional wrestling. Everything is about the current, and it's guys like yourself, and and thank God Brian's doing this podcast, and Austin Idol doing his podcast, and for me, I love it. I joked the other day to somebody that I'm going to have to quit my job. There's all these podcasts now, and it's history, and it's I don't have time anymore. I either have to give up sleep or work. It's one of the two. But it's absolutely incredible. And guys like Chris Swisher, who is just one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet, and so generous. He posts photos in my group literally every day, and you're 100% right. Everything is categorized, and it's cross-checked and cross-referenced, and he's just so good about it. And that's my goal. One day I hope I can get in my office that I've got and put everything in order, because right now I just have huge stacks of shit, and I can't.
Well, that's what Pete wants to do, with me, and he's always saying we got to get together for a weekend. I said, fuck, we'd have to live together for 6 months, and I'm not sure I like it that much, But
yeah.
We've talked about the conventions and stuff, but you were sitting on top of a gold mine, championship wrestling from Florida in the 70s. Like you said, every major talent in wrestling, because of Eddie Graham and his pull and the connections he had. You were there when Dusty Rhodes became the American Dream? Was that the hottest angle you ever saw? I've heard the stories that the buildings literally every town every night sold out for months. When Dusty broke off and switched babyface, broke off of Gary Hart's group. You got to see a lot of that. Dusty, of course, was the king of Florida. But what were the great matches? Who did you most enjoy watching at that point?
Oh, man. So, I always enjoyed Dusty in the earlier part of his babyface turn. So he turned in 74 and really throughout the rest of the 70s. In the 80s, I think that act was wearing a little bit thin on me, but I liked both styles. I liked the guys who would brawl and entertain, but I also liked the wrestlers. So Billy Robinson was always my favorite. And,
yeah.
He was, I know he could be a pain in the ass outside the ring, and I get all that, but what he did inside the ring to me was just absolutely incredible. And we were used to seeing fantastic wrestling. We had Jack Briscoe, all the great wrestlers, Bob Roop, all the great wrestlers came through. But when Billy Robinson came and he brought that British style, I was really just like enamored by that. I was like, wow, I never saw anything ever like that. So that was pretty hot. Dusty's feuds, though, were great.
We got actually kind of shafted here in Memphis on Billy Robinson, because when he came in, literally he came in as a babyface, nobody could work his style. And actually when I'd first seen him, and I'd said, I've heard such build up, and I've heard that he's the greatest wrestler on earth, and his matches kind of sucked. I mean, you could tell he was doing some cool things, but nobody knew how to take it or how to give it or how to work with him or whatever the fuck. And then all of a sudden, when they put the world belt on him that they had manufactured here, and they put it on him because he was such a nationally recognized name, he would defend against anybody. And that's when he got to work with Bill Dundee, who could do that shit. And those matches with Billy Robinson and Bill, then all of a sudden I saw, okay, yes, he is maybe the greatest in-ring wrestler, most believable, most technical wrestler in the world, because he and Dundee would go for 40 minutes. And Dundee knew from Australia and from his experience how to do that shit. And he could hang with Robinson, for most of it. But then again, at the same time, eventually Billy Robinson was going to blow anybody up he was in the ring with, right? If it was a really good back and forth contest. And we weren't used to seeing that, because Dundee's card, he was the guy that never slowed down and was a whirlwind. And even on the spot shows, he'd run circles around everybody. And I saw it one time, they had a match in Lexington that Luthez refereed. And at the end of it, Dundee is soaked with sweat, and he's fucking ready to heave, it looked like, and Robinson just picked his belt up and put it under his arm and walked right on back to the locker room. And Robinson had him by several years at that point. So that's when I got to see, Billy Robinson.
Yeah, it was. It was funny too. You say that because I remember having the same conversation with Norman Dooley, and Norman Dooley said, Robinson isn't that good. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He's not that good. He's the best I ever saw. And he goes, his matches are just kind of boring here. So you're 100% right. It's the right opponent for Robinson. I know that there's a couple of matches out there against Tony Charles that were exactly, and that to me is like, it's just gold watching that right there. But I remember Vern Gagne said this, and I remember Vern Gagne said it, and it made it into somebody's book. And I remember reading the quote, and it was something to the effect of, Billy Robinson can never get over with the fans. That for some reason he doesn't connect with the fans, and that's why I'll never make him champion. It was something to that effect.
I think it may have been more like Billy Robinson wrestle circles around me, and I was in NCAA champion. So I think I'll just keep the belt for the promotion I own, probably. But at the same time, in the AWA at the time, the Crusher was the big box office guy, and he was the complete antithesis of Billy Robinson. So maybe Vern was right.
Yeah, look, in Florida, it's the same thing. We could have Dusty Rhodes versus the Missouri Mauler in a tape fist match where you're going to get double juice and ringsiders are going to be splattered with blood. And then the match right before that is Billy Robinson versus Jack Briscoe. It's a complete babyface scientific match. So it was a real dichotomy in what we were seeing there, and that you're going to get this real intense professional wrestling, then you're going to have a full all-out brawl. And I think that was the formula that actually worked.
Well, and also I think it was Eddie Graham who said it was watching Billy Robinson and Tony Charles, because they did the same thing here in Memphis. They'd go to a 10-minute draw the first week. Then they'd go 15 minutes the next week. Then they'd go 20 minutes the next week, and they would build it that way. And it was that classic World of Sports style, but it was two salty old fuckers doing this, but it didn't look pretty. The guys who imitate the World of Sports style now instead of the Fit Finleys, but the young guys who have watched the tapes, and it looks so gymnastic and so pretty and so effortless. These were two salty old fuckers that looked like that they were kicking the shit out of each other while they were doing this shit. And I mean, Tiger Mask and Dynamite Kid stole the fucking spot where you push a test of strength finger lock and you push the guy on the ropes, and Tony Charles would monkey flip Billy Robinson, and then he'd flip over, but Robinson would catch him with his feet and he'd push him into the other side, and he'd jump up and monkey flip, and then they'd hold on and they'd go into the rolling cradles. But it looked like a struggle. And that's, I think, what the young guys have missed, is that they're doing the moves, but they're doing it as a choreographed routine, and rather than hold and counter that these old masters could do. And they looked like they were, and probably because the shit was hurting at the same time, but they looked like they were really fucking jockeying and fighting. And that's been lost. But Eddie Graham said, watching Billy Robinson, Tony Charles, said, well, it's a good match to have on the card, but you can't put it on top because it won't draw any money. And truthfully, it was part of the Florida package. Like you said, they had so many different styles, so many top stars, but they made sure to build to the personal issue and the grudge that the people could believe in, and knew they were going to see some violence. And that's what made the money for them.
Well, speaking of the Florida package, Barry, two quick questions from me, if you don't mind. One is, we hear so much about Dusty Rhodes when he turned babyface, but I've heard from a lot of people in Florida that before Dusty turned babyface, they were just crazy about Joe LeDuc. We always think of Joe LeDuc as this crazy heel, but apparently he was an amazing babyface in Florida. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that. And then on the topic of Florida packages, tell us a little bit about what you have coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you have no problem with that one. Absolutely.
Hey, wait a minute. First, Barry was talking about when he got laid. Now you're talking about Florida packages. Is this going to be a smut show here? No, go ahead. Joe LeDuc. I love Joe LeDuc.
Yeah, absolutely. So Joe LeDuc came into the state in '73, part of the tag team with his brother Paul LeDuc, became Florida Tag Team Champions, and then Paul suffered a career-ending back injury and went back to Canada. And he's a great guy. He's on Facebook. We're friends. And Joe kind of took off. Joe became a singles wrestler and had a great run throughout '74. I posted a photo today. It was a babyface match of Jack Briscoe defending the NWA title against Joe LeDuc in April of 1974. Then Joe left, came back in late '76, main event babyface, tag team with Dusty, stuck around through '77. And then he went off to Memphis. Then he came back in '79, came back in late '78 actually, was a babyface, and that's where the big turn occurred, where he turned on Jim Garvin in the bear hug and the bleeding of the mouth, and really went almost overnight from this really likable Canadian lumberjack with a heart of gold to this sadistic, crazed lumberjack. It was just like this 180 flip that he did. But he was super over. He was he was a guy. He held the Southern title, but he wasn't always in the title hunt. He was like one of those, kind of like an Andre the Giant in a sense, where the titles kind of weren't important in a sense.
Like Hacksaw Duggan in Mid-South, the kick-ass baby face that didn't really need the title. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Joe LeDuc didn't need the title. Everybody knew he was tough, and there's a match that's out there, and it's really odd to me. And I understand the logic and the booking behind it, but as LeDuc was getting ready to exit the state, Pat Patterson was coming into the state, and Pat Patterson slaps the figure four on LeDuc, and LeDuc submits. And I mean, when have you ever seen Joe LeDuc submit? It's the weirdest thing to me to be able to see this match, and it's out there. But LeDuc was great. As great as he was as a babyface, and he really was, when he took on that crazed persona in '79 at the foaming of the mouth and the crazy eye rolls and the screaming, he really just took it to another level. And I'll say this to the day I die, I'm not sure why he didn't main event Madison Square Garden. But if there was ever an opponent for the WWF champion at that time, Joe LeDuc was it. So it was great. I'm thrilled that he was working in Florida, but he was so good.
That's the heel Joe LeDuc is the one that we saw in Memphis when he first came in. He had been a babyface in Southeastern in Knoxville, and of course that's when they did the deal that actually made people think that Robert Fuller was a good booker. When they were doing a deal
Who
with
thinks that?
For a while, Jerry Jarrett enough to bring him to Memphis once, but they popped the territory in Knoxville when the Mongolian Stomper was a heel, and he was being managed by, I think, Gorgeous George Jr. at the time, and LeDuc was a babyface, and they were doing the deal where LeDuc was showing that you could take a sledgehammer and he would put a cement block on his fucking head and they would break it with the sledgehammer. And it ended up that Stomper hit LeDuc in the head, actually, without the block, knocked the block off, hit him in the head with a sledgehammer, put him in a fucking hospital for a shoot, which everybody knew. And then like a week later, just on his own, LeDuc, I heard the story as they tell it, comes in and runs in on the Stomper's match, and everybody went crazy, and that popped the territory, and everybody thought Robert Fuller was a genius.
Right. Yeah. So Memphis, I mean, there was two things that I remember about Joe LeDuc's run in Memphis, and certainly, and I think to this day, one was where he picked up Lawler, threw him over the top rope, and Lawler ended on the timekeeper's table.
Yeah,
and
well, actually, the table was 10 feet away, and he only threw him 9 feet. So
yeah.
He hit the edge of the table, and fuck, that right there, that was the most shocking thing anybody had ever seen.
And there was such a thud to that. And the second thing, which LeDuc, and this is all over YouTube, was the blood oat, where he takes the axe and he starts carving up his forearms. Holy shit!
I have a picture. The next week, he did that on Saturday morning, and on Tuesday night he's in Louisville, and he says, "Come here." Because, at the time I was kind of smart, but at the same time, you didn't admit those type of things in those days. Come here. I said, yes, sir. He said, take a picture out of my arm. And I looked, and I could have laid my index finger in the cut and it would have disappeared. And I said, oh my God, what happened? And he said, just take the picture. I said, yes, sir. And I still have that fucking picture.
Wow. Wow. He was such a nice guy too, though. And I only knew him obviously as a fan, but I've got a whole bunch of photos. I probably have 4 or 5 photos that I took with him. And in each one, he put his arm around me and smiled for the camera. And I got a whole bunch of autographs. So, as a babyface, he was so cordial, so friendly outside the ring. He
was a nice guy. When he wasn't working the heel gimmick, he was an incredibly nice guy.
Yeah. I was saddened actually when I heard that he passed too, because he passed fairly young. I think he was still like in his 50s.
Yeah.
So yeah, just a real shame. But we had so many guys that passed through Florida, and so many great angles, and it was funny. But Pete Letterberg pointed this out to me. I was there the night in in Miami Beach when Ernie Ladd turned heel on Dusty Rhodes, and it was almost a riot. And it was really the closest that I ever was to a riot, a full-out riot. And they had been kind of building this week after week, and it was Dusty and Ernie versus Ivan Koloff and Buddy Wolf. And they had been on TV every week, and they were doing interviews together. They were called the Superpowers at the time, and every week you could see that Ernie would start to talk and Dusty would cut him off, and Ernie would just sit there and kind of scowl at the camera. So they were building this, and this went on for about 4 weeks. And in Miami, we saw a lot of great stuff. We obviously had the world title change with Terry Funk and Jack Briscoe, but at the same time, almost all the angles took place in either Tampa or St. Pete. I mean, being that the cameras were all there, they didn't want to have to drive that shit to Miami. So it all took place down there. Well, we saw the cameras that night, and I don't think any of us still thought that turn was going to happen in Miami. And when it happened in Miami, it was, just the fucking, you thought the roof was going to come off. The cops were keeping fans out. And Miami was generally a civilized town. It wasn't like we were, in the middle of nowhere. It was fucking within insane.
Well, hey,
hillbillies or something.
So was Cleveland before Ox and fucking Ernie Ladd started that riot there?
Yeah, exactly. So it was, so that was huge. And then, and then seeing that the turn on Dusty just, 3 years later in Atlanta. So being able to be ringside for both of those, just so, we were so fortunate as fans.
Is there any way to explain, you're a wordsmith, Barry, is there any way to explain to the fans today with what they think is heat, is a lot of people making noise, and what they think is a babyface being over is the same thing? But in the days of the wrestling that we are speaking of, and you got accustomed to it, and that's what we all miss about it, because it's just not the same. There is no legitimate heat. There's no legitimate idolatry. You could cut it with a knife either way. And just the feeling and the emotion in a building when you get that many thousand people, there's no way to describe it that I've been able to think of to fans who you can't see it on tape. You can't feel that on tape. You can see them jumping up and down, but you can't feel it.
You can't, and it's there's no way to ever experience it. It's never going to come back. It's there was a believability factor that existed. It existed in adults. It wasn't just the kids. The adults believed, and I say this all the time. But when I started going to the matches, one of the real highlights for me was to be able to sit ringside and listen to the old timers who had been going since the 50s, and they would sit there and tell me about the Eddie Graham Malenko wars and the amount of blood, and they would swear to me that what you're seeing now with Dusty Rhodes is entertainment, but back then that was real. These guys were beating the shit out, and they believed it. And I would watch grown men, where the cops would have to come over, and these were men in suits. I mean, we're not talking about a guy in overalls. These were men in suits, and the cops would have to come over and force them back into their chairs because these guys were ready to jump in the ring because they believed that was real heat. And again, you're in an arena, you're in a venue, there's 4,000 people who believe in that venue. It does not exist these days.
Hey, one night, Billy Robinson is leaving the ring in Louisville in 1980. And as he's leaving the ring, and he actually was one of the matches with Dundee, so it was even a really good match. But as he's leaving the ring and he's carrying his belt, I remember this old man coming up to him saying, "Lou Thez would have kicked your ass." And he had probably seen Lou Thez in that same Louisville Gardens because Thez had been working there since the fucking 30s. And he had probably seen Lou Thez 40 years. This guy had to be in his 70s, right? And it just, I guess it's with every generation, but now we've lost that believability factor that hooked everybody to where you can't get that legitimate emotion again. And that's to me what made the matches and the angles was when you can get that many people willing to go to fucking jail on purpose because they've bought something, you're going to sell some tickets next week. And I know Brian is sitting there going, talk about the Florida package. What about your Florida package?
So now to be known as the Florida package, I may have to, I like that, Brian. Thank you. So So I was approached by former WCW ring announcer Dave Tenzer a few months ago, and he said, "Would you ever consider doing like a retired guys who work Florida FanFest? You know, guys who are important to the organization, guys like Steve Kern and Bugsy McGraw, et cetera." And I said, I got 2 kids, I have a full-time job. I'm happily married. I just don't know if I could find the time to do that. And we talked for a while, and I said, you know what? I think I really do want to do this. So we decided to do it, and it's kind of unique in what we're doing. We're doing a limited fan fest. It's only 200 tickets being sold, and we've got the original assassin, Jody Hamilton, there. We've got Steve Kern, Bugsy McGraw. We've got Ricky Hunter, the gladiator who worked in Florida in the late 60s. We've got Lady Maxine, if you remember Mad Maxine. Lady
Yes.
Maxine, 6 foot tall, with her first fan fest ever. She's never done a fan fest previously, so I'm friendly with her. And she said she would like. Was she in Mid-South when you were there?
No, I think that was either right before or right after.
Right after. She went in 1986.
Well, of course. Well, why would Brian know?
Brian knows. Brian does know. We got the Cuban Assassin, and then we also have the Saint. So we have a couple more names coming up. But so we're going to have some guys who are really important to the to championship wrestling from the state of Florida, and we've limited it to 200 tickets, and we're doing it in 3 stages. We're doing a regular fan fest, autographs, photos, whatever you like. Then we're doing a private cocktail party where you can gather up at the bar with all these guys and hang out. And then the third thing we're doing is we're doing a private dinner with Jody Hamilton, limited to 30 tickets. And if anybody wants tickets, those are all gone. Those have been gone for about a month now. But it's kind of unique, and it's not something that I'm expecting I'm going to make a ton of money or anything like that. It's not what it's about. It's for me. It's about being able to be a part of something that's different. I've been to so many of these fan fests.
It's going to be fun. It's going to because it's more personal and interactive.
It is. It's really intimate, and that's kind of what we're saying, is that it's an intimate fan fest. And I've been to fan fest. I saw you at the fan fest a few years ago, but a lot of times, you wait in line for 40 minutes, you get an autograph and a photo, you shake a hand, and it's literally a 90-second experience. And our goal here is that you can actually have a meaningful, compelling conversation with the guys you grew up watching on TV. So response has been great. We're about 60% sold, and we're still 6 weeks away. So really excited about it.
What's the date again? What's the date?
It is June 3rd, taking place in Odessa, which is a suburb of Tampa, and it's at the American Legion Arena.
And how would the folks go about getting some more of the tickets that remain while they still can?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, Jim. Thank you. If you go onto Eventbrite, you can just put in CWF, Championship Wrestling from Florida, or you can go to my Facebook group, which is Championship Wrestling from Florida Archives, and you can purchase tickets through either of those portals.
And an easy way to remember is tinyurl.com/CWF Legends.
You know what? You just like to say that tiny URL over and over, don't you?
I have stock in the company.
It's the rib now. Until Brian actually spoke it out loud, I thought it was 10 URL. And but anyway, well, you know what? We could do this all night, and many of the listeners have probably already said they already have. But nevertheless, because we did a bunch of bullshit before we even got to you, Barry. But I always enjoy talking to people, not only who were fans and can testify to the greatness that was classic wrestling, but also trying to tell the young folks the fan club scene and what it was like, and the links that you had to go through in those days to really be a dedicated, we didn't even use the word hardcore, but just a diehard or just dedicated or just super fan. It was fun, and we had a lot of memories, and obviously we all met people that, no matter, how long it is in between visits, you're always friends because we bonded over that type of thing. And it was a chance to meet like-minded people that were just as crazy about something as you were.
Yeah, it really was. It was such a great period of my life, and and I did get to meet. I got to. This is so funny, but I remember the first time I ever saw you on television, and I think we hadn't talked in probably 2 or 3 years, and I turn on TV, and there you are, and I'm like, look at that son of a bitch, Jimmy Cornette's on TV. So that was really, really cool to me as well, as being able to see people coming. Eddie Gilbert, same thing, and I knew Eddie. Eddie wanted to be a wrestler when I met him, and he was already in training and everything, but it was just such a great experience. But being able to see the success that hardcore fans, and we were super fans, we were diehard fans, and you actually were able to get into the business and become really successful in the business. So I'm done blowing you at this point. There's
well,
not
no,
much else
keep blowing, keep blowing. No,
keep going. All right, keep going. But
when you think about it, also, there was a lot of talent at ringside taking pictures. It's some of the between Eddie Gilbert and myself and Brian Hildebrand, and I'm sure I'm leaving a few people out. But Heyman probably was he was a photographer.
Yeah.
Might have been at some of the ones later on in the '80s. But there was a lot of future talent milling about in the peanut gallery.
Yeah, it was too, and it's I was talking today, and it's Fred Ottman, Tugboat and Shockmaster. He was a fan in Miami for years before he got into the business, and Steve the Kid Collins and Tom Nash and Ricky Santana. So it's just it's funny,
Dave
all
Heath,
these guys
Dave Heath was a super fan
Dave
down
Heath?
there.
Absolutely, yeah. All these guys who were just fans.
Gangrel, everybody, ladies and gentlemen.
Yep.
I guess I've just exposed Dave's business, but
it's the Florida package, absolutely.
Well, listen, good luck on that, and tell Jody we all said hello. And he's got some stories to tell that go back to the 50s, and he was the youngest guy ever to main event a sellout in Madison Square Garden.
Yeah, absolutely, too. So I will. I'll pass it on. Jim, thanks again for having me. Brian, thank you, and continued success, my friend.
Well, thank you. Brian, did we cover everything, at least as best as we could, do you think, since you know everything?
I approve of this ending. So, yes, we've covered everything.
In that case, for the man who invented the Thrill Seekers, Storm and Jericho need to send him 10% of all future earnings. Barry Rose, and for my co-host, Hawaiian Brian, blah, blah, blah. You know the drill, everything, the great Brian Last. I'm Jim Cornette. This is The Experience. We'll see you next week. Thank you. Fuck you. Bye.